I'm Greg Jarrett.
I'm Sandra Smith.
I'm David Asman, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, August 11th, 2021. I'm Dave Anthony. New York's governor is on his way out. Andrew Cuomo has resigned in a sexual harassment scandal, like many of his fellow Democrats called for, joining Republicans.
He was just continuing to fight more, and this style of harassment, bullying, intimidation, and abuse only was growing stronger than ever. Everybody decided that they had enough and it's time for him to go.
We speak with GOP Congressman and candidate for New York Governor, Lee Zeldin.
I'm Jessica Rosenthal. Turns out there is some bipartisan agreement when it comes to roads, bridges, airports, and internet access, maybe even electric cars. But any political goodwill on infrastructure may be short-lived.
The country needed to feel like there is some way forward, that we can still do bipartisan work.
And I'm Jimmy Failla. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
A Democrat star has fallen.
It's true that your greatest weakness is also your greatest strength.
To many, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo shined in those daily COVID chats at the start of the pandemic.
Our closeness makes us vulnerable.
He even won an Emmy and got a $5 million book deal. Oh, how things change.
My resignation will be effective in 14 days.
Over sexual harassment.
The most serious allegations made against me had no credible factual basis.
Cuomo claiming the state attorney general's investigation that found he sexually harassed 11 women had serious flaws.
I do hug and kiss people casually.
Denying that he intentionally touched anyone sexually or inappropriately. President Biden was among the many fellow Democrats who had called on Governor Cuomo to resign.
But he's done a hell of a job. And, both on everything from access to voting to infrastructure, to a whole range of things. That's why it's so sad.
Democratic State Senator Todd Kaminsky told Fox,
well, the Attorney General's report painted a really nauseating portrait of the governor's behavior that was just too much to overcome, and the president knew that.
And Kaminsky says so did the governor.
He knows voters have turned against him.
Republicans have been wanting Cuomo out since the controversy over the governor's order to send COVID-positive patients into nursing homes last year, then not counting as nursing home deaths those who died after being taken to hospitals.
The governor had to resign. He seems to have been the last one to have gotten the memo to realize that he should have resigned if for no other reason a deadly nursing home order and cover-up.
Republican Congressman Lee Zeldin is also a candidate for New York governor.
He was looking at what was a growing certainty that he was going to be impeached and removed. There are growing criminal investigations that are out there against him. His attorneys didn't do him any help. Some ridiculous excuses coming out between the governor and his attorneys to try to explain away his behavior. Their continued attacks on accusers, investigators. Every day was getting worse, and as more and more facts came out, it was clear that there was all sorts of bad behavior to infuriate just about everybody. But as he was just continuing to fight more, and this style of harassment, bullying, intimidation, and abuse only was growing stronger than ever, everybody decided that they had enough and it's time for him to go.
His words were, "I truly believe it is politically motivated, unfair, untruthful." Basically, he thinks that he was almost railroaded out of office, it seems.
It doesn't seem like there's any allegation from these accusers in the AG's report where it was because Andrew Cuomo is a Democrat that they're submitting their accusations against him. I mean, it's an absurd angle, and of course that is going to get investigated. And actually, a lot of Cuomo's adversaries and allies were all saying that there should be due process, that there's an allegation made, he should be able to tell his side of the story, and then there's a product of that investigation, and there are findings. We knew a long time ago that there were enough facts that were out there to justify him resigning regarding the deadly nursing home order and cover-up. But with regards to these allegations that were in the AG's report, many people said these are very serious allegations. They should be investigated if true. He was trying to avoid impeachment and removal. He realized that he was going to not be able to get himself reelected next year. But just the way he chose his words, he's trying to dodge accountability here. He's not seeking it.
This is now the second time. 2008, Eliot Spitzer, Democrat, resigned as governor in a prostitution scandal. So for the second time in 13 years, New Yorkers have a governor who is out of office, walking away in resignation. What does that mean for the state?
This doesn't work, this one-party Democrat rule that we have right now. It doesn't work for New York State to be electing people who view themselves as emperor governors or think that New York likes to have emperor governors. That idea of going out there and just trying to roll everybody, building up a house of cards of support to harass people who don't agree with you on policy or media that might not be acting as if you have editorial control over every single thing that they're writing all the time, and you're trying to bully them into covering stories they don't want to cover. There's just so much of a lack of respect all around that anybody who is seeking to be a governor anywhere, whether it's in the state of New York or it's anywhere else, anyone who's just looking to be a good, decent person with a compass that is set correctly, you can learn a lot about what went wrong, what was Andrew Cuomo's downfall, what was Eliot Spitzer's downfall, and make sure that you don't sign up for it. You don't let history repeat itself. This is not the way to govern.
What does this mean for you running for governor now as a Republican, knowing that Andrew Cuomo will not be someone you're trying to unseat in, say, 2022 if you get the nomination?
We're still running against the failed liberal policies of one-party Democrat rule in Albany, and we still have New Yorkers hitting their breaking point, and they're talking about rising crime in their neighborhood. They want to repeal cashless bail. They want to support law enforcement more, not less. They want the quality of education to improve. They don't want their kids going to school for an indoctrination or brainwashing. They want them to just go for a quality education. The cost of living hasn't gone down because Andrew Cuomo announced his resignation, and he's being replaced by his lieutenant, who in many respects was empowering this activity inside of their administration, oftentimes being silent from scandal to scandal.
Are you going to give Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul a chance? She's going to take over in a tough spot. What do you want from her?
Well, for one, she's going to have to provide her own accounting because she is under a lot of criticism for never saying anything about any of this. I mean, she's basically capitalized off of the governor's style. I mean, I've seen it firsthand in working with her, where it's almost like she looks up to Cuomo's style of arm-twisting, harassing, intimidating. You have a bully pulpit as the lieutenant governor of the state, and she will as the acting governor of New York.
Lastly, the impeachment investigation. Do you think this should end? Is that the end of it? Do you believe in the New York State Assembly?
It would be foolish for them. It would be the wrong decision if they said that they don't want to pursue any accountability on behalf of any of the victims of the nursing home deaths and that scandal or any of these allegations that have been made. If they're not pushing for there to be accountability related to crimes that were committed. If their play call is not to talk about any of this anymore, to not have hearings, to not seek out truth and answers, well, then it's going to come back and hurt them when they're running again next year.
Well, we thank Republican Congressman Lee Zeldin, and now move on to the legal issues for soon-to-be ex-Governor Cuomo. Former federal prosecutor Andy McCarthy is a Fox News contributor.
He's facing a criminal investigation now, we learned over the weekend, because Brittany Camiso, who was the last of the complainants on the sexual harassment front to come forward, filed a police report in Albany County, which the sheriff is investigating as a criminal case. But as the sheriff said over the weekend, that's being investigated as a misdemeanor, which is probably what it is under state law. In a trial of Cuomo on that allegation, you wouldn't get, 3 or 4 or 5 other women come in and testify about their experience. So it would really be his word against hers. There's not a lot of corroboration for it. It's not the kind of thing that under those circumstances normally gets prosecuted. So I'd be surprised if that ends up in a guilty verdict for the governor. Not impossible, but I'd be surprised.
Okay. What about the other 10? I mean, you have other allegations here. Are any of them potentially criminal beyond a misdemeanor?
I don't think so. Most of the allegations against Cuomo are not physical assault, and to the extent that they are physical, they're not really in the nature of what under New York law is treated as felony sexual assault. And a lot of them are kind of stale. I mean, they happened a long time ago. There's not forensic evidence to corroborate them. The state trooper's allegation may be corroborable because they say that there are witnesses to that, but I think it's unlikely he'll be prosecuted on those.
Yeah, well, I know that Lindsey Boylan, one of the accusers, plans to sue the governor on this. So what civilly is the legal threshold, and what would that kind of a trial look like?
Yeah, it's interesting, under Cuomo, because he wanted to be, in his preening kind of way, he wanted to be seen as a leader on, the Me Too movement and reacting to that. So they made sexual harassment easier to prove under New York law while Cuomo was governor. I think the problem for Lindsey Boylan is that her claims temporarily happened before the law became easier. So she has the problem of her lawsuit both being a little bit on the stale side and not under the more forgiving new standards.
The Attorney General's investigation found that the governor broke state and federal law. Is there any sort of a federal probe that comes out of this in your view?
Well, there already was a federal probe that was directed, as far as we understand it, toward the cover-up of the mishandling of the nursing homes.
Right, and the undercounting of nursing home death patients and all of that, but that's totally separate, right?
It's not necessarily totally separate. I mean, we understand that a federal investigation, which is being pursued by prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York, that's the Justice Department's office in Brooklyn, we understand that investigation was triggered by the nursing home scandal, but prosecutors aren't limited to investigating only what they open a case on. And usually when you investigate someone, it's a broad investigation, and if you find other crimes, they get added on.
You have dealt as a prosecutor with people who've been charged. You've dealt with people clearly from the political realm at some point. In your crystal ball, do you see a day in which Governor Cuomo has to sit at a trial for any of this?
No, I don't see that on the horizon. So most of the time what ends up happening with these things, Dave, is the page gets turned and everybody wants to move on. And I imagine that other than for the sexual harassment complainants who want to file suits, I wouldn't hold my breath waiting to see the federal government or the state government take action against Cuomo.
Andy McCarthy, former federal prosecutor, Fox News contributor. Good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
This is Jimmy Failla with your Fox News commentary coming up.
They've been talking about it for years and promising that it is an area of bipartisan agreement. Infrastructure. No one really moved on it until now. 19 Republicans joined Senate Democrats to pass a bill that commits to spend money on roads, bridges, and airports, but also new spending on electric vehicle charging stations, electric school buses, upgrading the electric grid, and changing out old lead pipes.
For the Republicans who supported this bill, you showed a lot of courage. And I want to personally thank you for that. And I've called most of you on the phone to do just that. You have, and no doubt you will, disagree with me on many issues. But where we can agree, we should.
President Biden called the package transformational. While 19 Republicans did join to support the bill, the rest of the Republicans did not. Some members of the Progressive Caucus in the House on the Democratic side said they won't support it either unless a much larger, roughly $3.5 trillion package is passed as well that contains what they call social, human, and climate infrastructure. That package would have to pass through reconciliation, so no Republican votes would be needed. President Biden said he expected both would pass.
And I think that the House will eventually put two bills on my desk, one on infrastructure and one on reconciliation. Thank you.
Either way, he said the passage out of the Senate on this first bill shows that democracy can still work.
It is good to recognize that we can still get things done in a bipartisan fashion.
Elissa Slotkin is a Democratic congresswoman from Michigan.
I was heartened to see that and appreciated all of my Senate colleagues doing that. My view on this is we should be voting as soon as possible on this bipartisan deal in the House. Strike while the iron's hot. And mostly because last year when we were doing our bipartisan COVID bills, my experience was they don't have a great shelf life. If you let them sit too long, people start to pick at them and pick them apart and change their views on different pieces. And so I'd like to see this come forward as soon as possible, ready to come back to Washington to vote on it as soon as the Speaker calls the vote.
And how would that work logistically? Because you guys are on recess. The House is on recess right until September 20th? So somebody would have to formally say, okay, everybody, let's go back to D.C., right?
Yeah. And, we're on district work period. Some of us are going to be back in Washington in August for various committee work. But we've been told when we left, we were told, hey, you need to be on an 18-hour string, as they say in the military. You need to be able to come back and vote and get from wherever you are back to Washington to vote. So, heads up. So we took that to heart. And I think most of us are prepared to do that in an even shorter time period.
Let's talk about the politics of this, because while the word bipartisan is being used to describe the agreement here, we have heard from progressives like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, others, even Speaker Pelosi, that this $1 trillion package will not go through the House without the Senate first approving this sort of larger spending plan. I think it's in the neighborhood of $3.5 trillion. So how long might this take? Like, you guys won't get called. Will you get called back to vote if the Senate hasn't passed this $3.5 trillion extra spending plan?
Yeah, well, certainly I would like to vote on the one that's ready to go right now. It doesn't mean I'm not willing to look at an additional bill. I will look at any bill that any colleague of mine from either side of the aisle puts in front of me. But there's no text on that larger budget reconciliation bill. I haven't, no one's come to explain to me how it's transformational and targeted. I think in my mind, the Speaker could move to call a vote since it's bipartisan. Obviously, she is the Speaker, and she can decide what she's going to do. But my preference, as many of us have expressed, is that we vote on the one that's ready to go, and then we come back in the fall and consider the budget reconciliation bill. But it's her call.
What do you say to those who argue, that this whole debate shows that the progressive wing of the Democrats, the people more further to the left, that they are increasingly calling the shots here, as they have threatened to not pass the bipartisan legislation until this larger spending plan is also up and ready for them to vote on, meaning that has also gotten through the Senate.
I mean, I guess I don't see it the same way. The framework that was the basis for this bipartisan bill that just passed by a really wide majority came from a group of pragmatists in the middle, Democrats and Republicans, frankly, in the House, in something called the Problem Solvers Caucus. We came up with a framework, and it's basically what ended up being fleshed out and passed in the Senate. We were the ones who are actually pushing to have something on the table now to get it done as soon as possible, and it passed. And I think the country needed to feel like there is some way forward, that we can still do bipartisan work, that despite being so polarized, there is actually groups of people who are willing to sit down in a room, put their heads down, and hammer something out. I can't speak for progressive colleagues, but in my book, and certainly in my district in Michigan, people see that package after 4 years of hearing about infrastructure and not getting anything, they see we've done that and they want it to go that final mile.
Talk to me about what's in it, because we keep hearing that there is like about half of this spending, the $1 trillion package, that about half of it is new spending versus what? Versus spending for programs that already exist. Can you talk about sort of the difference there and what that means?
Sure. I think one of the reasons this package garnered a lot of support, particularly among people who consider themselves fiscally responsible, is that it basically allows for monies that were already allocated under previous COVID bills to be repurposed for infrastructure. Meaning we've seen that some accounts that we've approved, even a year ago under COVID bills have just not been spent. It's just sitting there. And so now we're saying you can spend it on infrastructure. You have that money in your account. You don't have to spend it just on PPE and masks and COVID testing. You can spend it on water infrastructure, broadband internet, roads, bridges, tunnels. So that's where half of the spending comes from, is kind of sweeping old COVID accounts. And then the rest of it is new spending. And, it's more or less a 21st century infrastructure bill. Yes, it's the roads and dams and bridges. It's fixing our water infrastructure, which is a big deal in Michigan, like our sewage treatment plants. We have a real water issue in Michigan, but it's also stuff that's newer, broadband internet. This bill will allow communities across the country, including rural communities like I represent, to get universal broadband, to enter into public-private partnerships and get every citizen broadband internet. In some of my districts, only 1 out of 10 don't have access to the internet. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I think that it not to mention, let's say, electric vehicle infrastructure, charging stations, so that we can actually compete with China and France and others on electric vehicles.
But some of that stuff isn't traditional, right? Because we are talking about building out electric vehicle charging stations, like you just noted. Yeah. And part of this is electric buses for schools. And some of this is the White House fact sheet I was reading is, removing separations within communities. I wouldn't even know how that works. If a highway is going through a community and it's separated, I don't know how you bring that back together. But when we talk about the electric vehicle aspect of things, that's really banking, interestingly, on Americans going electric pretty rapidly here.
Yeah, but it's happening. I mean, look at I'm from Michigan, right? So the big three autos were just announcing that by, I think it's 2030, I might get my dates wrong, half of their fleets at least will be electric. I mean, it's the way that we're going. And I sure as heck want American car makers to make the future of electric vehicles, not Chinese or French or anybody else. So, it may not be what we saw in the 1950s, but we shouldn't be just spending on infrastructure that was important in the 1950s.
Congresswoman, talk to me about the Congressional Budget Office and how they have said that this isn't quite all paid for, that $256 billion over 10 years is not accounted for here in this. And I know there's a lot of disagreement and argument over the accounting, right? Like what the Congressional Budget Office says can be counted as dollars that can go to pay for things versus what some of the negotiators in the Senate have said, we're going to get money from X, Y, and Z program. We're going to take it from over here and pay for it this way. How do you sort of explain to me and average Americans that this is paid for, or is it?
Yeah, well, like I said, half of this bill comes from sweeping COVID accounts that have been that still have cash in them from the past year. So,
and the CBO doesn't account for that, right?
Yeah, it doesn't account for that.
Okay.
But then also, I think that the thing, normally when we're explaining how we're going to pay for things, we show where we're going to cut or where we're going to pull back. And I think infrastructure is one of those things that's just, most people accept it as an investment in our country. Just like, putting in the highway systems in the middle of World War II was something that was an investment in our country long term, allowed Americans to crisscross the country after something that was really built for war. Infrastructure investment is something that comes back to us over time. When companies come and invest in my community because they have better roads and better bridges and better infrastructure, that's going to come back to us in tax dollars. When you invest in our schools or you invest in broadband internet so that an entrepreneur doesn't have to move to California to launch a startup, he can do it from Holly, Michigan. That's an investment that's going to return itself in economic growth and in those tax dollars that accompany it.
Well, there are some economists, though, that really don't think this is going to boost the economy that much, at least not in the short term. And they're more worried in the short term about inflation. It sounds like you're saying maybe those are valid short-term concerns, but you're not thinking short-term.
We just can't. Infrastructure is not something that we can do on even a 5-year timeline. And anybody in Michigan, we had 2 dams collapse in the past 18 months. We had 10,000 people in the middle of the night who had to run out of their homes because waves of water were coming through crumbling dams. So you can't think in 1-year, 2-year, 5-year increments. You have to think strategically when it comes to infrastructure. And it is a big price tag. No one's going to say it's cheap to do it. I just believe there's a significant return on investment.
Final question. Are you on board for the roughly $3.5 trillion package that, that many of your colleagues are insisting must pass?
It's so funny. Everyone asks me about it. I have not seen one word of text of this bill.
Right.
The only thing I've seen is that top dollar figure, which is significant, big. And no one's come to show me the bill text. No one's coming to lobby about how this is going to be transformational. I'm willing to hear anybody out, particularly if you told me that there was going to be a budget reconciliation bill that would bring, for instance, universal child care, would change the face of our economy, would change the face of what women could do in this country. I would seriously consider that, but no one's come to me with real text right now, and I still read bills before I decide how I'm going to vote on them. So that's what I'm going to do.
Congresswoman Slotkin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I'm Guy Benson. Join me weekdays at 3 p.m. Eastern as we break down the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest newsmakers and guests. Listen live on the Fox News app or get the free podcast at GuyBensonShow.com.
Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Jimmy Failla.
What's on your mind?
So Andrew Cuomo resigned as governor of New York, and it's about damn time. Cuomo was a national embarrassment, and I know a lot about national embarrassments because I'm a New York Jets fan. History will show that Cuomo was a serial pervert and a weapons-grade liar, but above all else, he was dumb. This dude wrote a self-congratulatory book about how to handle the coronavirus in the middle of the pandemic. That's the football equivalent of dumping the Gatorade on yourself at halftime of a game you're not even winning. Cuomo was dumb to write the book. He was even dumber to believe the media would cover up his disgusting behavior once they were done building him up as a means of tearing down Donald Trump during the election. And that's exactly what happened here. The media cheered Cuomo on last spring because the better he looked, the worse Trump did. They even gave him an Emmy for his leadership. At the same time, nursing homes were howling that he was getting people killed with his executive orders. But they didn't cover that scandal because they had an election to win and Cuomo was their useful idiot. The good news for Cuomo is he served his purpose and helped get Trump out of the White House. The bad news is he and his brother are full-time idiots, and the media only needed part-time employees. Be sure to listen to Fox Across America with me, Jimmy Failla, weekdays from noon to 3 on the Fox News app or foxacrossamerica.com.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. New from the Fox News Podcasts Network.
My name is Kennedy, and welcome to my podcast, which will, I humbly say, single-handedly save the world. You're welcome.
It's Kennedy Saves the World. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.